Twins. I was house sitting for the maestro, the great painter and my former mentor. After my wife died, I plunged into a deep depression. I didn't want to be in our home anymore, so I'd go to the studio all day. But I didn't want to be in the studio either, because it was merely the dark and dusty corner of an abandoned plastics factory overcrowded with junk. I used to revel in its squalor, but after her sickness and rapid decline, emptiness reminded me of death, and I was haunted by the hollow sounds that echoed throughout the day. I visited the maestro one afternoon and told him that I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I couldn't work in my dark, dusty corner anymore. He too had lost his wife some years back, and so I asked him, "How long will this last, maestro?" And he told me that it never goes away, that he always has the feeling that his wife is just around the corner or in the other room, or that any moment he'll hear the car in the driveway and she'll honk her horn for him to come help carry in groceries. It just gets easier somehow, he said. And sometimes, too, it helps to have a change of location. I can't afford to go anywhere, I told him. That was when he told me he was going to be in Europe for the year, teaching art in Florence, then later in Bordeaux, and he needed someone to watch over things. "You can use my studio, of course," he said. The maestro's house, a beautiful old Victorian painted beige with turquoise and rust trim, was full of light. Every room painted a bright, bold color, the exact opposite of his monochromatic paintings. His work adorned the walls, large, expressionistic portraits, along with a lifetime of photographs, old friends, the maestro and his wife, their children as kids, their children now grown, their children with their families. There were hundreds of books stacked every which way. To the left of the maestro's house was another old Victorian. To the right was a lot with 3 small duplexes painted a sickly avocado green with cracking brown trim. The lot was filled with junked cars lost in overgrown weeds. It was an eyesore, and the maestro had tried with some success to block it with shrubbery and fences. On my first night in the maestro's home, I awoke to flashing red lights filtering through the guest bedroom's lace curtains. At first, I thought I was having a nightmare, reliving the night the ambulances arrived to take away my wife for the last time. I lay there a minute before rising from bed to see what was going on. I pulled the curtain aside and saw a police car. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed in the porch light 2 small, shirtless boys huddled together. They were seated on the concrete porch, their arms apparently cuffed behind their backs. Were the cops arresting these poor boys? I wondered. I saw a cop talking to a wild-haired, obese man who was also shirtless. He was waving his arms and alternating between grabbing his stringy hair and rubbing his enormous hairy belly. I couldn't hear what he was saying at first, but after a while I made out his blubbering. "I don't have any control over them. They don't listen to me." I watched the scene for some time, disturbed but unable to turn away. Finally, a cop walked over to the little boys, lifted them from the porch, escorted them into the police car, and drove off, leaving the wild-haired fat man alone to gripe to the moon about his children not listening to a damn thing he said. It was an altogether odd scene. I couldn't figure out why it was the children and not the fat drunk who were led away in handcuffs. 2 days later, I saw the boys return, again in a police car. I was watering the maestro's plants and flowers alongside the house. The boys were in the back seat, their heads barely visible above the window. The cops stepped out of the car and opened their door. One scooted out, and then the other. I now saw that they were twins. They were also older than I thought them to be the other night, 11 or 12 rather than 7 or 8. They were still shirtless. The cop got back in the car and drove off, leaving the boys alone in the potholed gravel driveway. They turned to stare at me. I avoided their gaze, pretending to focus on the task at hand, but when I looked up, I saw that they were still staring with their beady blue eyes. I smiled at them, but they didn't smile back. They just kept looking at me with a transfixed expression on their faces. I couldn't tell one from another. "Hello," I said, to be friendly, and for the lack of anything else to say. They were quiet for some time before one of them said, "Where's the old man?" "The old man," I said. "You mean the maestro?" They looked at me confused. "I'm watching his house for him," I said. They continued to look at me as though my presence confounded them. "What are you doing?" the bolder one asked. I chuckled. "Well, I'm watering," I said. His eyes narrowed. "We used to help the old man water," he said. "You did? Is that right?" I said. "Yeah, and you know what? He had us water these flowers over here on our side." He pointed at something on the other side of the white picket fence and then bent down as if he wanted me to see the flowers for myself. "Oh, he didn't tell me about those," I said, walking toward them. I didn't really believe him, but I decided to play along. I wanted to be friendly. The other brother remained still, his back erect, like a soldier standing at attention. He looked frightened. "If you give me the hose," the talker said, "I'll water these flowers over here." Without thinking, I released the spray nozzle trigger and handed him the hose. Then I peered over the fence. As I suspected, there weren't any flowers. I peered farther. There was only weed grass along that entire side. In a somewhat patronizing tone, I said, "Now just where are those flowers you helped water?" When I turned to him, I saw that he was pointing the nozzle right at me. Up until he pulled the trigger, I didn't really believe that he would spray me. It was so unfathomable that I mistook it for impossible. In a matter of minutes, a child, fresh out of juvenile hall, just dropped off by a patrol car, interrupts my watering, attempts to trick me into handing him a hose, which I do for reasons I can't quite explain, then sprays me with it. But that's exactly what he did. He sprayed me, first in my face, and then when I said, "Hey, quit that," and raised my forearms to protect myself, he sprayed me again, this time in my crotch. Then he tossed the hose, grabbed his brother's hand, and they ran away giggling. I couldn't move as I was so shocked. From a safe distance away, I heard the twin call out, "Look, he peed! He peed his pants!" I looked down and saw that my pants were indeed drenched. I went inside, more bewildered than anything else, and changed clothes. I didn't return that evening to finish watering. I should have. The longer I stayed inside, the angrier I grew. My wife would have called it stewing. I knew that she would be laughing at me. "You were the dummy to hand him the hose," she would say. And I probably would have laughed with her. But she wasn't around to say it any longer, so I was left to my curmudgeonly thoughts. Honestly, I wanted nothing more than to drench the kid with the nozzle on full blast. My wife was a school teacher, and she loved children. All children, no matter how rambunctious or devious. When I saw the twins, I wondered if she would have loved these children too. Of course she would have. She would have felt sorry for them. No mother to take care of them. And their father, Wayne, just a raving fat drunk, whom I would see stomping around the yard, calling out their names while they hid from him. He was an imbecile, a fool. A man like him shouldn't have been allowed to have children. He could have children, but I couldn't. I hated him for it. The only time I enjoyed the twins' mischief was when he was the target. They would construct pits for him to fall into. They would piss into his beer bottles and whiskey flask. They would spray him with water. It wasn't just me, thank goodness. They would torture him as he lay in the grass nursing a hangover, tickling his nose with dandelions. And all he would do is holler. They would never listen, but he still hollered. And then he would chase after them, but he never could catch them. They were too fast. And they knew where to hide, or rather, Wayne didn't know how to look. No, they're not in the tree, I wanted to scream, or you already looked underneath the car. I watched it all from the maestro's house, sipping coffee as I stared out the window, as though I were observing wild beasts at the zoo. I don't know what it was that finally got the bolder of the twins locked up in juvenile hall for an extended period of time. I just remember seeing the remaining twin slowly walk back and forth along the driveway, dejectedly, not knowing what to do with himself. 1 week passed, then 2, then 3. And still the lone twin just walked back and forth all day. He looked so sad and lonely that I started to feel bad for him. At one point, peering out from the guest bedroom window, I saw him with a long stick, drawing or writing something in the dirt in front of the maestro's house. He could have just been making marks, but he seemed far too concentrated on his task. Later I took a walk just to get out of the house, and on my return I remembered to look at what he had been doing. It was a drawing of some sorts. I looked closer and saw it was a rendering of the maestro's house. Actually, I thought it quite good considering it was made with a stick. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the twins' drawing, and I thought of something my wife used to say. There is wonder in each and every one of us. She would have said that if she saw his drawing. How had he learned to draw? I couldn't imagine him sitting inside that cramped apartment with enough time or space to make anything worthwhile, but somehow he had taught himself. Did the other twin know how to draw too? The next morning I awoke early and walked out to the studio. I hadn't yet been able to produce anything. I was too daunted by the maestro's studio, by his lingering presence. I didn't want to mess anything up. But those were just excuses. The truth is, I felt no desire. But this morning was different. I felt inspired. I wanted to work. And I felt in a way that I owed it to the twins' drawing. Something about the marvel of its creation, that it was created at all, made me cherish my vocation, what talent I did have, what creativity I had in store. I had to find that spark again. So I entered the studio and pulled a few sheets of paper, but as soon as the blank sheet was in front of me, my inspiration turned to dread. And I could only think to myself, what does it matter anymore? I tried to muster the energy, but I gave up and walked outside. Through an archway in the side yard, just above the white picket fence, I saw the twin walking along the gravel driveway, forlorn as ever without his partner in crime. I was struck with an idea. I called out, "Hey! Hey!" He quickly raised his head from the ground and then looked as if he was about to take off before being scolded. "Wait!" I cried out, and I walked briskly toward him. He stood frozen. "I saw your drawing yesterday," I said a little too excitedly. "The one that you did in the dirt." He just looked at me with wide eyes. I knew he was quieter to begin with, but Without his brother, he was practically docile. "It was of the maestro's house," I said. He looked at me without recognition. "I thought it was great," I continued. "Really great. I mean, you have talent." Now he looked at me suspiciously. "What do you want?" "Just that," I said. "I just wanted to let you know that I was impressed. I'm an artist too, just like the maestro. Did you know that he was an artist?" He shrugged. "Well, he's actually a famous artist. Well known, at least. He was my teacher long ago. Have you ever had lessons?" "For what?" "Drawing lessons." He shook his head. "Would you like some?" I asked, surprising myself. I wasn't sure I wanted to offer, but wasn't that why I had approached him in the first place? "I hate school," he said. "This wouldn't be like school. We just draw, that's it. The maestro has plenty of paper and drawing supplies in his studio." He shook his head unsurely. I could tell he was thinking about it. "Let me know if you change your mind," I said. He walked away without saying a word, and in a way I was relieved. "At least I tried," I told my wife. The following day my work, or lack thereof, was disrupted when I heard a knock on the studio door. "Who is it?" I asked. No one answered. I slowly opened the door and found the twin. He was standing there shirtless, his arms behind his back, his blue eyes looking at me nervously. He looked like a startled cat. His mouth was bright red, as though he had just had some fruit punch. "You came," I said. "Come on in." He took a cautious step into the studio, looking around himself, his eyes darting every which way as he absorbed the new surroundings. Momentarily relieved of my own creative block, I reached for the sheet of paper I had been staring at for the previous hour and said, "I had this waiting for you." I pulled up a stool and patted it. "Take a seat. I'll get you some drawing utensils. How about that?" I felt as if I was shouting. He still hadn't said a word. I found him a piece of charcoal, a shading stub, and an eraser. I got my own as well and told him that we'd both draw together. I pulled out another sheet of paper for myself and clipped it to a drawing board. Then we sat, neither of us making a move to place charcoal to paper. An awkward silence reigned in the studio, and for a moment I thought of rising to turn on the radio, but I didn't feel like fiddling for a new station. I was sure he wouldn't want to listen to whatever talk show was currently on NPR. "What do you want me to draw?" he said, finally. "I don't know," I said. "What are you going to draw?" I shook my head and laughed. "That's a good question. What do you usually like to draw?" "When I'm with my brother, we like to draw zombies eating people." "Oh, is that right?" I said, imagining the maestro's $5 sheets of paper covered in gory zombie drawings. "How about when you're alone, what do you like to draw?" He shrugged. "Well," I said, "what if we drew each other?" "What do you mean?" "While I'm drawing you, you can draw me. How does that sound?" He seemed to like the idea, and we went to work at once. At first I felt somewhat uneasy drawing this young shirtless boy, and I almost wished, for the sake of appearances, that I'd suggested something else. But soon I became engrossed in my subject, and I lost myself in the details of his face, his bony frame, and his eyes so focused on his own drawing. At one point I asked him what his name was, and without looking up from his task, he mumbled, "Nicholas." I told him my name, but he didn't seem to care. In fact, the entire time he was drawing, he barely glanced up at me. He just kept focused on his task, his mouth pursed in concentration. At some point I stopped, but he continued for a good while longer before stopping too. You done? I asked. He nodded. I looked down at my own drawing. I felt a great weight off my chest. I had placed charcoal to paper for the first time in months. The boy was a worthy subject. I held it up for him to see. I thought he would be impressed by the likeness, but he just looked at it as if he'd seen 1,000 portraits of himself. Can I see your drawing? I asked, rising to look over his shoulder. It's of me, right? Yup, he said. I leaned closer. He had drawn me all right. To make it clear, he'd written the word you and an arrow along with a zombie eating out my brains. The drawing sessions continued. Every afternoon he would show up and we would draw each other, or I would draw him and he would draw either zombies eating me or me as a zombie. To be honest, he didn't have much talent. I started to wonder if he was even the one who drew the Maestros house in the dirt. Maybe someone else had drawn it and he was just making marks around it. But he seemed to enjoy himself, which was good. One day, he was a little later than usual, but I soon heard a knock on the studio door and I rushed to open it, quickly turning back to my task without checking to see who was there. I just assumed it was Nicholas. Your paper is already out, I said. I was expecting you an hour ago. My dad wouldn't let me come until now, he said. Not a problem, as long as you came. Shall we get started? I sat down with my sheet of paper and grabbed a China marker. I had planned on trying a different technique this day. Okay, I'm ready to start drawing, he said as he plopped down in his seat and picked up a piece of charcoal. What should I draw? I furrowed my brow. Usually Nicholas wasn't this talkative. He just came in and set right to work. I didn't think much of it, though, as I was anxious to start drawing. I picked up the China marker and unwrapped the paper to reveal more of the greased tip. I stared at the contours of Nicholas's torso, shirtless as always, and made a few measurements. I lightly traced up to his neck, his jawbone, his ear, and then fixed the spot on the top of his head. I was making a full-body portrait, so I hadn't yet reached the face, but already I noticed that Nicholas was more fidgety than usual. I glanced up and saw that he wasn't focused on his drawing either. He usually made strong, committed lines, pressing hard on the paper, but today he was scribbling rapidly, looking at me and then back at the paper, jumping from one end to the other. I thought, this is strange, but wasn't I also experimenting that day? I continued to lightly shade in some of the volumes when he moved his pose completely. You have to sit still, I said, without looking up. You like drawing me a lot, huh? He asked. Yes, sure, I said absently. Then after a pause he said, would you like to draw me in a different way? Well, I'm trying this China marker. Maybe you'd like to try a different drawing utensil too. I can take a look. Let me just get down your pose first. I meant, would you like to draw me differently? What do you mean? I asked, still only half listening. I made the final measurement and looked up. What if I took off my pants? He asked. Would you like to draw me then? What the? I stopped. It took me only a brief moment to realize that I wasn't talking to Nicholas. They may have been identical to the untrained eye, even to the inattentive eye, but now that I was looking at him, the differences were vast. He didn't have Nicholas's scar on his lip or the one on his chin. He was paler and had fewer freckles, probably because he'd been locked up for the month. His hairline was lower, his ears stuck out more, his overall facial structure was wider. These were all very slight things, but taken together they made all the difference. It wasn't just the physical differences, though. There was something else about him. I looked into his eyes, and had the strange sensation that there was nothing behind them. "You're the brother," I said. "Dennis." "What are you talking about?" "Where's Nicholas?" I asked. "I'm Nicholas." "You're not fooling me," I said. "I know you're Dennis, and you tried to play a little trick on me. Well, very funny. Now where's your brother?" Dennis began to cackle. "Don't you want to see my drawing of you?" he asked, obviously not caring that I caught on to his game. He held up the paper for me to see. I didn't even look at the drawing. I set my drawing board aside and rose from my chair. I very briskly walked to the studio door and opened it. I turned to Dennis and said, "You need to leave," and I pointed outside. He was smiling as if he was enjoying himself thoroughly. He rose from his seat and sauntered toward me, passing his hand along a table, knocking over everything on it. An empty coffee mug, a plastic container full of colored pencils, a stack of books, an empty Coke can, smiling all the while as he had a secret he couldn't bear to keep to himself. "Hurry up," I said sternly. He walked by and stood at the threshold of the door. "My brother told me what you did to him," he said. "What are you talking about?" He shook his head in exaggerated disapproval. "How you touched him! He told me all about it." "Get out of here!" I exclaimed. And instinctively, I reached out to nudge him from the doorway so that I could close the door. Immediately, he turned rabid. "Don't fucking touch me!" he screamed, his face beet red. "Don't ever fucking touch me or I'll fucking kill you! I'll fucking kill you!" "Get out of here!" I cried again. He moved just enough for me to slam the door shut. My heart was pounding. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know whether to stand or sit. I sure as hell wasn't going to resume drawing. I took the one I had started and crumpled it up in my hands and tossed it into the wastebasket. It was then that I heard a large thud against the door. I rushed toward it, then hesitated, not knowing what I would find on the other side. Maybe I'd open it and be assailed by rocks or dirt clods. I waited for a moment and then nudged the door open slowly. I peeked my head out. I looked around for the twin, and in the distance, through low-hanging tree branches and leaves, I saw both twins running down the driveway. My heart sank. Nicholas had played a part in this. I looked down and saw what had created the thud. It was a large terracotta pot, now in pieces. It would have been too large for one person to lift alone. The plant had fallen out, its roots poking through clumps of wet dirt. "Fucking kids," I muttered to myself. My heart was still beating fast, my hands trembling. I wasn't so much angry as deeply unsettled. I wanted to excuse Nicholas somehow. Maybe he didn't know what his brother was going to do. Maybe Dennis had exerted his power over his brother, and Nicholas had no choice but to play along. But hadn't he helped his brother hurl the pot against the door? I recalled when Dennis had sprayed me with the hose, and they both laughed at me. I had wanted revenge. I didn't want revenge anymore. I just wanted the twins to disappear. I didn't want to see them ever again, and I felt myself a fool for thinking that I could change the direction of their miserable existence. I found all the drawings I'd made in the last month, all of them, all of the Nicholas drawings. Nicholas focused and attentive, Nicholas lost in his world of zombie-filled imagination, and I crumbled them up and tossed them in the trash. I heard another knock. I didn't want to answer it. I wanted it to be a figment of my imagination. But the knock came again and again, and I briefly entertained the idea that it was Nicholas returning to apologize. I rose from the chair and walked in a daze toward the studio door. I opened it to find Wayne. He was standing there holding a white binder and looking down at the broken pot. "Wayne, I can't," I said. My voice was weak to the point of breaking. "I can't. I'm telling you, my boys are worthless," he said. as he lightly brushed soil and broken pieces of broken pieces of terracotta off the step with his boot. They don't listen to anybody. They don't listen to me. They don't listen to you. Wayne, stop, please. I don't want to hear any apologies. Hell, I didn't come to apologize. I already warned you about them. Look, I'll come right out with it. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I just wanted you to see for yourself what I'm capable of doing. I think that if you and me work together, I might be able to do something with the talent God gave me. Now I'm just going to leave this here for you, and you look at it when you get a chance, okay? He placed the binder in my hands, forcing me to hold it or else let it fall. He quickly turned and walked away, almost skipping as he reached around to hike up his sagging jean shorts. "Wayne!" I called out limply. But he was already on the other side of the yard. I stared at the white binder in my hands. It was dingy and worn. Curiosity compelled me to open it. Every page was protected in a plastic slip sheet. On the first page was a quote by Edmund Burke. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." After that, I found pages of awkwardly rendered copies of comic book heroes repeating more or less the same thing. Captain America. "If we don't do anything, then evil will triumph over good." Spider-Man. "Evil will not triumph over good as long as we fight against it." Batman having a conversation with the Green Lantern. "It doesn't matter if we're good. If we don't do anything, then evil will triumph." I closed the binder and pressed it to my chest. I didn't know what to feel at that moment. I just knew that I didn't want that binder in my possession a minute longer. I had to rid myself of it. I walked out of the studio and practically ran through the maestro's garden. After struggling to open the warped and sagging side gate, I entered the neighboring complex and walked down the potholed driveway toward Wayne and the twins' apartment. Once on the porch, I knocked on the door and looked around myself. I could hear the hum and hollow drip of the swamp cooler. I smelled cigarette smoke and cat shit. I saw broken glass everywhere. I saw a checkerboard on top of a dirty styrofoam ice chest. The black and red plastic pieces scattered everywhere. No one came to the door. I knocked louder, this time with my palm open, slapping my hand against the doorframe until my skin stung. I stopped and looked to my left, and that was when I found myself, for the first time, staring at the maestro's beautiful home as if I were his neighbor, as if I weren't house-sitting, as if I didn't know the maestro at all, as if I'd entered some alternate reality where I was doomed to live alone in this squalid one-bedroom apartment with my incorrigible offspring drawing nothing but comic book characters battling evil for the rest of my life. I imagined stepping out the door day after day, forced to contemplate the mirage next door, for that's what Maestro's house looked like. An illusion never to be touched. Good God, I said to myself. I placed the binder on the doorstep and hurried back to the maestro's yard as quickly as I could. Several days passed before I was able to muster the energy to return to the studio. You have to work, I kept telling myself. But when I finally entered, I merely sat down on the maestro's comfy old paint-splattered chair, leaned my head back, and stared at the ceiling. I charted the cobwebs gathering in the corners. I followed the slow rotation of the ceiling fans. I searched for faces and animals in the ceiling texture as though I were looking at cloud formations. I did this until my neck began to hurt. As I was massaging the kink out, I happened to turn my head toward Dennis's drawing, which was still on the drawing board where he'd last left it. Somehow I wasn't surprised to find my own countenance staring back at me. A mess of quick lines, nothing more than raw gestural marks. And that little bastard had conjured up the wretchedness of my life. Picked up the drawing and stared at it, unable to turn away. In the back of my mind, I could hear my wife laughing, the delightful mocking laugh she made when she was proved right about something. I started to laugh with her, because what else can one do?